If there's no objection, we'll do the, work through the consent agenda, and then we'll move item L1, the discussion of expulsion procedures, because we have a guest up to that portion of the agenda. Okay, so
Peter, just as a formality, again, I'm requesting to pull number 4 off the consent agenda because it's an agreement, and there may be new board members that, again, part of it because it's an agreement. I just think when we have something that looks contractual, we should probably just not have it on the consent agenda. So
okay.
I'll approve it quickly next.
I would ask for a motion for approval. I'm sorry, I skipped public appearances. Are there any public appearances? No. I'd like a motion for approval of the consent agenda, items 1 through 3 without 4.
So
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
And seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? And motion carries. And now I'd like a motion for approval of item 4 on consent agenda, 66.0301, agreement with Wisconsin Educators Risk Management Cooperative.
So moved.
Been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Is any discussion?
Could somebody say
I
a
just
word
wanted to
about
make
it?
sure you guys knew what it was, what you're approving. And if you do, that's fine. We'll just approve it.
Any questions?
Do you want somebody to say something, or just asking them?
Can you give
Well,
us, can you give us the 30-second?
Yep. So we purchase our property insurance, liability insurance through a cooperative with the number of school districts for the state. In order for us to do that, we have to have a 6603 agreement, and that's what this is for.
Gotcha.
Is this the M3 on the belt line?
Nope, this is not.
It's a different one?
This is a
Different.
different one. This is actually just a group of school districts that have come together and work with
Okay.
an insurance agent that bids out.
All right. All in
Thank you
favor?
for taking it on.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. And now let's move on to the discussion of expulsion procedures, item L1. And Dan?
Sure. With us tonight, we have Attorney Shayna Lewis, and who is serving as our independent hearing officer for expulsions. And this is something that, as you recall, the board has recently, revised our expulsion policy, but more importantly than the policy is we following the statutory requirements with regard to if we choose to use a hearing officer, which this board has elected to do, is something annually that you need to approve. But the fact that we have Shayna new working with the district this year, I thought it'd be, first of all, a great opportunity for you to get to meet her, and then also talk a little bit about the procedures, because I believe most, if not any of our board members, have actually been part of an expulsion hearing, and so to make sure we understand that it is a very important thing that we go through in the decision making, and you get an opportunity to ask any questions, and she'll speak a little bit to that process as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I see a lot of familiar faces around the table, familiar names that I am finally putting faces to their names. My name is Shayna Lewis, as Dr. Olson mentioned earlier. I am with a firm here in Madison called Strang, Pattison, Renning, Lewis, and Lacey. We are a very new firm in that we opened our doors on April 1st. But our firm is made up of attorneys who have a significant amount of experience in representing school districts across this state. And that really is the purpose of the law firm. It was to be designed to be what it needed to be for public school districts and other higher education institutions. I recognize some of you, and you may recognize my name or my face because I used to work for Lathrop and Clark, which is now has merged with Boardman and is now Boardman and Clark, who I understand continues to work with you. Mike Julka was someone I worked with for about 10 years, and I understand that he's a familiar face around here. So that's who I am. As Dr. Olson mentioned, you guys were in need of an independent hearing officer for your student expulsions recently because of the retirement, the second or third retirement. Joe Hill has had many wonderful acts in his career, and he decided recently to leave the area of independent hearing officer serving in that role for school districts. And so you guys were in need of an independent hearing officer. And given my experience representing school districts, doing expulsion hearings in a variety of different manners, from sitting with the board during an expulsion hearing, representing the administration during expulsion hearings, and serving as an independent hearing officer in other school districts, Dan and your administration thought it would be a good fit for me to come in and replace Joe Hill. So we've already had one student expulsion, as you know, and there will be others, unfortunately. We hope to not have to use my skills very often during the school year, but certainly I'm available to you as you need me. Dr. Olson really asked me to talk a little bit about, what is an expulsion hearing, what does an independent hearing officer do, and what is it that you guys have hired me to do, and answer any questions that you have about the student expulsion, student discipline process. The first thing you should know is that you guys have a policy, Board Policy 447.2, which gives you the authority, which you've taken advantage of the authority under Wisconsin Statute 120.13.1e to appoint an independent hearing officer. But before we talk about the real details about what an independent hearing officer does, I thought we'd briefly talk about pupil suspensions and expulsions kind of generally. The right to attend public school in the state of Wisconsin is guaranteed by the Constitution. However, school boards have had the authority to expel pupils since before the 1870s. There have been many iterations of the Wisconsin pupil expulsion statute, but it actually has been in existence since before the 1870s. Today, that authority is found in Wisconsin Statute 120.13 sub 1 sub c, and it allows a school board to expel a pupil for any number of reasons, but they have to be the specific statutory reasons that are articulated. Those reasons include repeatedly refusing or neglecting to obey the rules, knowingly conveying or causing to be conveyed any threat or false information concerning an attempt or alleged attempt being made or to be made to destroy any school property by means of explosives. That's essentially a bomb threat, which unfortunately we've had too many of them in this area recently. Engaging in conduct while at school or while under the supervision of a school authority which endangered the property, health, or safety of others. Engaging in conduct while not at school or while not under the supervision of a school authority, which endanger the property, health, or safety of others at school or who are also under the supervision of a school authority, or which endanger the property, health, or safety of any employee of the school district or any school board member of the school district in which the pupil is enrolled. And then, of course, the possession of a firearm, and the term firearm is defined in the federal law, and possession of a firearm while at school or while under the supervision of a school authority. With all of the above reasons, the school board must be satisfied that the circumstances are such that the interests of the school demands the pupil's expulsion. There are also some special rules regarding expulsion of students who are 16 years of age or older. In those situations, the school board may also expel a pupil if the school board finds that the pupil repeatedly engaged in conduct while at school or while under the supervision of a school authority, that disrupted the ability of school authorities to maintain order or an educational atmosphere at school, or at an activity supervised by the school authority, and where that conduct doesn't otherwise satisfy the other portion of the student expulsion statute, provided, of course, that the school board is satisfied that the interests of the school demands the pupil expulsion. So, as I said before, it's really important to note that these are the only reasons that a school board can rely upon in order to expel a pupil. If conduct is engaged in by a student that doesn't satisfy one of those statutory provisions, you may discipline that student in a variety of other ways, but you cannot expel the student from school. On a related note, and I'm only going to talk about this very, very briefly, but with regard to its suspensions, a pupil may only be suspended for 5 consecutive school days And the suspension may be extended to 15 consecutive school days if a notice of pupil expulsion hearing has been issued. Therefore, in any situation where a student is going to be removed from school for disciplinary reasons for beyond 5 days, it actually has to be a situation where an expulsion is at least being considered. So the notice of pupil expulsion hearing has been issued. We'll talk a little bit about the length of expulsions in a few minutes, but there are some expulsions that are literally 30 days. And that does actually constitute an expulsion as opposed to a suspension. So it's important to recognize that. The length of an expulsion can actually be through the pupil's 21st birthday. We get that maximum because of the Wisconsin Constitution's right to attend school through age 20. And so you're expelling someone through their 21st birthday, meaning that you are removing them from school for the entirety of the period of time that they would be entitled to attend school through the Constitution's guarantee. Of course, it doesn't have to be through the 21st birthday. It can be for a shorter length of time, as we talked about before. Could be as short as 30 days or maybe 16 days in some situations. And we'll talk about what goes into that discussion and decision making. Within legal parameters, the school board also has discretion with regard to the conditions that apply to the pupil during the period of expulsion, including whether the pupil is permitted to return to school before the conclusion of the expulsion period, and if so, the conditions that apply during the expulsion period, but when they would be able to return to school. That is something that I think is a big myth about the issue of expulsion. When a student goes through an expulsion hearing and is actually expelled, it's very rare that the student is not allowed to come back to school pretty quickly, whether it's at the end of a semester, at the end of a school year, at the end of 18 months, something like that. It's very rare that there are no conditions offered with regard to the ability to come back. And then certainly during the period of expulsion, those conditions that would apply can help to change the student's behavior while they're under the supervision of the school district, but still under the expulsion order. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. It's important to know that an expulsion, student expulsion, may only occur after the pupil has received notice of the pupil expulsion hearing and the hearing has occurred. There are some situations where the notice of pupil expulsion hearing is issued and the student decides to withdraw, or the student decides that despite being told that he or she has the opportunity to attend a hearing, just does not show up, does not want to participate. In those situations, we still go through the notice, or we still go through the expulsion hearing, and we follow as many of the procedures as we can that are outlined in the notice of pupil expulsion hearing, simply because it is important to go through that process, because in your case, the independent hearing officer, but the school board typically is the one that makes the decision about expulsion, not the administration. The administration is merely making a recommendation. The statutes, Wisconsin statutes, specifically Wisconsin Statute 12013 sub 1 sub c, and the statutes that come beyond that explicitly address what must be included in the notice of pupil expulsion hearing and what must occur during the pupil expulsion hearing. The hearing is actually a quasi-judicial hearing, meaning that a court reporter is present to create a transcript of the hearing. Witnesses are sworn in, and the rules of evidence are respected, albeit not completely. It's a little bit of a loose application of the rules of evidence, but generally speaking, we do deal with the submission of evidence through testimony, through documentation. We do discuss at times the issue of hearsay, and an expulsion hearing should not be based solely on hearsay testimony. We talk about the admissibility of certain types of documents, like law enforcement records, and a pupil expulsion, again, cannot be based solely on a law enforcement record, on a police report. You have to have some other type of evidence to corroborate or otherwise prove some of the actions that are described within the police report. During a pupil expulsion hearing, the administration presents its arguments first, presents its arguments and its evidence to support the recommendation to expel based on the specific grounds that are articulated in the notice of pupil expulsion hearing. That is something that is extremely important because of the statutory requirements relative to the notice of pupil expulsion hearing and the actual conduct of the pupil expulsion hearing. So the administration presents its argument and evidence, and it presents that argument and evidence in the form of testimony, documentation, items that it submits into evidence. The pupil and his or her parents or representatives, because in some cases the pupil is represented by an attorney or some other advocate. In other cases, the pupil attends by himself or herself, or simply with a parent or both parents or other family members. The pupil and his or her parents or representatives always have the opportunity to review the evidence that is submitted by the administration and to cross-examine any witnesses that they present. That is part of the responsibility of the hearing officer, is to make sure that the pupil and his or her parents or representatives understand that that is their right and to give them the opportunity to do so. After the administration presents its case, the pupil and the parents or representatives have the opportunity, but not the obligation, to present any evidence, testimony, documentation, or other items that they wish to submit into evidence. I say they don't have the obligation to do so because it's true, they could attend the hearing and do absolutely nothing, say nothing, put nothing into the record, but it's still the administration's burden to prove that expulsion is appropriate under the circumstances. And so they have the opportunity to listen to the administration's evidence and argument and have that burden still apply to the administration. In some cases, the pupil is going to challenge the factual assertions that are made by the administration related to his or her conduct, and the pupil may testify about that. In those situations, then the administration has the opportunity to cross-examine the pupil and any witnesses that he or she presents. In other cases, when the pupil doesn't challenge the factual assertions, the pupil may not actually testify but may participate in the hearing in other ways. Regardless, as I mentioned before, regardless of whether the pupil testifies or presents any evidence, the administration still has the burden of proving by a preponderance of the evidence that the pupil engaged in the conduct set forth in the notice of pupil expulsion hearing, and that the interest of the school demands the pupil's expulsion. Once all of the evidence has been submitted, the administration presents its recommendation regarding the length of the expulsion, whether conditional reinstatement will be offered, and if so, the conditions applicable to that reinstatement. The conditions, if you're going to have any conditions in an expulsion order, the conditions may include conditions that the pupil is required to meet before reinstatement, as well as conditions that the pupil is required to meet once reinstatement has occurred. At no time, however, can conditions extend beyond the expulsion period. That's important because that sometimes turns on why it is that the administration will recommend a longer expulsion period in order to kind of keep a thumb on the student throughout a longer period of time, while still allowing the pupil to return to school and participate in the academic environment, extracurricular environment, but still have an extra added responsibility to adhere to these conditions for a period of time. And again, the administration and an expulsion order, the administration can only recommend, and an expulsion order can only identify conditions that apply during the period of the expulsion. In addition, the conditions must be related to the reasons for the pupil's expulsion. So if we have conduct that is set forth in the notice of pupil expulsion hearing that is relative to drug use, then we would look to the conditions and make sure that the conditions relate to the issue of drug use on school property. Maybe that means that we are requiring some kind of drug testing or random searching of the student's person or property. but we have to make sure that whatever those conditions are, they actually relate to, they have some nexus with the reasons that the expulsion is being recommended originally. In addition, we have to be careful about the conditions and make sure that they are consistent with the procedural review provisions within the statute. There are specific procedures that apply when a student has been conditionally reinstated and then violates those conditions as to when the conditional reinstatement can be revoked. And we need to make sure that we are not putting in other procedures that interfere with those statutory protections related to conditional reinstatement and revocation. Basically, there are rules associated with the evidence that would be submitted in response to an allegation that conditions have been violated. There is a review process that is simply through your administration. There is no involvement with the board and no involvement with the independent hearing officer. It really is simply an administrative responsibility. And I've seen in certain situations where an expulsion order has incorporated some board review at some level during that conditional revocation, conditional reinstatement revocation, and that would be improper and could end up violating or voiding really the expulsion order. So we want to be careful about that. At the time that the administration presents its recommendation relative to the length of the expulsion, the conditional reinstatement, and the conditions that apply, the pupil and his or her parents or representatives have the opportunity to respond to the administration's recommendation. In some cases, we've heard the pupil and the parents say, that's fair. I hear that a lot, especially when a family hears expulsion and believes that that means that the pupil is never going to be able to return to school to complete their education in the particular school district. So sometimes when they hear that they are able to return at the end of a semester or at the end of a school year or maybe even the next day, in those situations, often the parents and the pupil will say, we can respect that. We understand and we're comfortable with that recommendation. We'd be all right with that. More often, though, the parents and the pupil argue against the recommendation, often saying that they've learned their lesson, that going through the expulsion process is lesson enough, is creating the responsibility, the accountability that the parents were looking for, or that the pupil needed. And in those cases, the pupil and the parents or the representative argue against a lengthy expulsion, argue against a delayed date for conditional reinstatement, or argue against expulsion altogether. They certainly have the right to make those arguments, and the school board, or in this case the independent hearing officer, has to take that into account and hear what the student and his family or her family is saying, and determine whether to accept the recommendation or modify it in some way. After considering the evidence and arguments presented during the pupil expulsion hearing, the school board, or in your case the independent hearing officer, is required to issue a written order if the decision is to expel the pupil. And the pupil is permitted to appeal that order to the state superintendent of public instruction. As I mentioned before, and the reason that I'm here is that Wisconsin Statute 120.13 sub 1 sub E authorizes the school board to appoint an independent hearing officer to conduct the expulsion hearing and to issue the expulsion order. You, your board, have taken advantage of that statutory authority and appointed me to serve as the pupil expulsion independent hearing officer. As a result, all of the description of the process that I described is something that I'm responsible for. I conduct the hearing, evaluate the evidence, assess the credibility of witnesses, consider the recommendation of the administration and the pupil and parent response or representative response, and determine whether to expel the pupil. And if so, identify the length of the expulsion, whether conditional reinstatement will be offered, and if conditional reinstatement is offered, identify the conditions related to such reinstatement. I commit those decisions to writing in the form of an expulsion order, which is then provided to the administration with a copy sent to the pupil and his or her parents or representative, and then a copy sent to you. After you receive the expulsion order, then you have the opportunity, really an obligation, to review the order or the decision of the independent hearing officer to determine whether to reverse, modify, or affirm the order. During your review of the independent hearing officer's decision or order, you may wish to review the transcript and the exhibits marked during the pupil expulsion hearing. That said, the board is not permitted to rehear the matter since it has already delegated that authority to the independent hearing officer. So if the board is concerned about a particular issue after reviewing the order, maybe after looking at some of the exhibits or portions of the transcript, if you're concerned about a particular issue that occurred or did not occur during the pupil expulsion hearing, it would not be proper for you to invite the parties into a board meeting to answer questions or to provide you with some elaboration or clarification of what was presented at the hearing. Instead, what your responsibility would be is to remand or send back the order to the independent hearing officer for further hearing in order to address the particular issue that you're concerned about. And that's very clear in the statutes, pretty clear in the cases that have been decided with regard to expulsions, is essentially a school board cannot retain the authority to conduct the hearing and also delegate that authority to the independent hearing officer. This is a decision that you make on an annual basis as to whether to use an independent hearing officer, and you may decide at some point that you do not want to do that anymore, and then at that point it would be perfectly fine for you to resume that responsibility and serve as the hearing tribunal with regard to student expulsions. That would eliminate then the independent hearing officer's responsibilities and would put that responsibility on you to actually hear the case and review the evidence at that point. I'm often asked about the impact of an expulsion on a pupil. It is something that parents are often very interested in. As we talked about before, the myth that an expulsion means that the student is never welcome in school again is just that, it's a myth. Many students come back during an expulsion period under the conditional reinstatement order or come back after the conclusion of the expulsion period and go on to graduate and do wonderful things with their lives. In your situation, we're also concerned though about what happens when a student is expelled and is not offered conditional reinstatement right away. In your district, I understand that there's a commitment to educating all pupils, even when they have been expelled and not yet reinstated. The district has that obligation with regard to special education students, but not really with regard to regular education students who do not have an IEP. But I understand that you guys have made a commitment to provide that same education during that period of expulsion to all students, and certainly adhering to that policy is positive for those students in getting back into the district and becoming productive members of the school district once they are back. In some cases, though, the student will be expelled and decide that they'd like to try their hand elsewhere. They'd like to enroll in school in another school district. It's important to know that in the state of Wisconsin, a public school district is not required to admit or enroll a student who is under a current expulsion period or expulsion order during that period of time that it's in place. That's to say that they do not have the obligation to. They may refuse to admit that student. They do have the opportunity if they'd like to. If they look at a student and see something in that student that makes them think that they would be successful in this other public school district, that other public school district has the opportunity to reinstate them or allow them to enroll. They can either do so without conditions, or they can do so under a conditional enrollment order. And in that situation, it looks very much like what your conditional reinstatement order looks like. It doesn't have to be identical to the one that you've issued, but it could be any number of conditions so long as, again, they relate to or pertain to the reasons for the expulsion originally. In some cases, the student will enroll in a private school, and the rules with regard to private school attendance and enrollment are selected by and determined by the private school. In other cases, the pupil will go out of state, and depending upon which state they happen to reside in, that state may or may not have rules that prohibit or permit them to enroll in school in whatever residence school district they're attending or that they're living in, to enroll without conditions or without concern. They may actually have the opportunity to do so or the right to do so, and the expulsion order issued by a Wisconsin public school district may mean nothing. There are some states, however, that like Iowa and Illinois and Minnesota that do take some indication as to what is said in a pupil expulsion order as they are evaluating students for enrollment. Some students, however, go to virtual schools or other kinds of academies that are either private or as I mentioned, out of state, and it really depends on what the rules are that apply. It's important, though, to think about what it is that students do after an expulsion order has been issued, especially if they don't come back here right away or take advantage of your academic support while they are out on expulsion order, because pupils who are expelled continue to be responsible under the compulsory attendance law. So it's interesting how those two laws work together, where you as the resident school district have the right to expel under certain circumstances, but that does not change or otherwise affect the pupil's responsibilities to find a school to attend. Maybe it's a home-based school, maybe, as I said before, it's a private school, but they still have the obligation to enroll and attend under the compulsory attendance statutes. As I mentioned earlier, a pupil is permitted to appeal the expulsion order to the state superintendent of public instruction, and once an appeal is received by DPI, the decision must be issued within 60 days. DPI will not overturn an expulsion order based on an allegation that the punishment was too harsh, or that the punishment, the penalty was inconsistent as it relates to other students who were not expelled for the same conduct or something like that. DPI simply will not overturn an expulsion order on that basis. DPI will, however, overturn expulsion orders based on procedural errors. And that's why it's very important for your administration, for your independent hearing officer, for anyone who's involved in your pupil expulsion hearings, to make sure that they are aware of what those laws require and any changes that occur with regard to those laws over the years. Because failing to comply with those statutory provisions governing expulsion will end up having DPI overturn the expulsion order. An overturned expulsion order really doesn't do very much other than require you to go through the whole process again. That can be time-consuming. It can be very frustrating when you're dealing with a student who has trouble with authority. When DPI comes in and says, you guys have done something wrong relative to an expulsion, sometimes that can empower a student and make him feel or her feel as though they didn't do what you've accused them of. So certainly doing it right the first way, doing it right the first time is really the best way to deal with it. I haven't touched on the complexities involved in expelling a special education student. Needless to say, there are special rules that apply arising out of the IDEA. Your administrators are aware of these obligations, as is your independent hearing officer. And I'll always inquire as we go into a hearing as to whether the student is a special education student, in order to remind the administration and the pupil and his or her parents or representatives that there are special rules that apply, and make sure that before we go through with an expulsion hearing that those special rules have occurred. We also haven't talked about the expulsion of an open enrolled student. There are special rules that apply in that situation, and that's again something that when it comes up, we deal with it. That is really all I have with regard to student expulsions. I think it's a lot of information, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about student expulsions, about myself, about the firm, about anything related to student expulsions.
Okay, before you do that,
Yeah.
just a little technical
Oh,
issue.
no.
Jeff, who couldn't be with us in person tonight, is actually having a little trouble with the audio, and we want to.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, see, she's just for a couple of minutes, so it was working fine, so we'll take care of that first.
That's why I was texting.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't even notice that he was over there.
Yeah.
How's the hearing, Jeff? Obviously not
too
very
good.
good.
We can try to call him on the landline, but he said he's in his basement. So,
Is he on a cell?
but we don't know what I'm sorry, we can call his cell phone. Jeff, can you hear us?
Is this, sorry, oh, just hand it to me, running video. Oh, we should-
Probably shouldn't. Hello?
Hello? Yes, it's Jeff, it's us.
We should probably mute his.
Would you mute your computer one for us?
Yep.
Perfect.
Can you hear us talk?
All right, can you hear us talk?
Yeah, I can.
Perfect. All right, thank you.
Shana.
Okay, going on to questions. Dean had his hand up first.
That was a superb presentation.
Thank you so much.
Concise, to the point, and it's a marvelous thing that somebody can give a good presentation like that without PowerPoint.
See,
I think it's
I know
helped.
the technology problems, so I decided I'm not here, but for me. And so I'm making sure that I do it without PowerPoint is a good thing. Thank you.
But I think it was a very concise, very informative presentation.
Thank you.
Questions? I thought it was extremely comprehensive, actually. I want to thank you for coming in here. We have,
I have a question
Yeah, I was
for
gonna
you.
say.
Jeff, that's right. I got-
You knew Jeff was going to have one.
Go ahead, Jeff.
So, sorry, you got a little muffled at the end there, but you said we have a responsibility or I forget what you said. We have a responsibility to review the order when it comes back to us from you, correct?
Correct.
So how do you suppose we do that without the transcript?
I didn't say that you do it without the transcript. You actually have the right to require the transcript as well as the exhibits, and the order is what you are reviewing with regard to reversing, modifying, or remanding it, or affirming it, or remanding it back to the independent hearing officer. What you cannot do is rehear the case by inviting the parties in to provide clarification or elaboration on topics that you don't believe were fully clarified or elaborated during the hearing. Rather than do that rehearing, what you would do in that situation is send it back to the independent hearing officer with some direction about what to do.
Because I've been invested on our last one, that I asked for transcripts and they told me that you were not going to provide them to us.
No, that's not accurate. That recommendation did not come from Shana Lewis. That was, and that's something we can talk about, but that was based upon a recommendation I received from another attorney.
Did you hear that, Jeff?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Another question for you. How would you feel if there was a major decision in your life decided by somebody that was paid for by the other side of the table with you?
How would I feel if there was a major
What I'm
decision?
saying is I know that you work for us in reviewing our expulsion order. Do you think that's a little intimidating for the people or the student that's going through the expulsion?
Yeah, I can tell you that the alternative way to do an expulsion without an independent hearing officer is to bring the student before the entire school board. And in that situation, the administration is presenting a recommendation to the school board, evidence to the school board, and the pupil and his parents sit in a room just like the one we're in right now. where Dr. Olson and your other administrators have a relationship with the school board that's much different than maybe the pupil and his or her parents do, or the representative does. And so I would say that I don't think that having a hearing before a single individual in a room in the middle of the afternoon is more intimidating than having the student and his family come into a room like this and defend himself or herself before the entire school board.
Okay. All right, that's fair. I'm good.
Thanks, Jeff. Dean?
Just, I was at DPI, I was deputy superintendent, I used to supervise the hearings of those. In general, I found that the very few school districts that we got, that when the cases that we had hearing officers. I can only remember one or two offhand. It seems to me that almost all the ones we had did not have hearing officers, and it appeared there was a wide variation in the conduct and evidence and procedure and that sort of thing, including political connections of board members to families of, quote, good kids and, that sort of thing. Is that I know that's a full employment recommendation for you, but is that, from what you know about current DPI practices, would that still be roughly the same?
Yeah, I would tell you that I believe that, we have 424 school districts in the state of Wisconsin, depending upon at which point you make that count. But at this point, I think it's still 424. And of those, I would say probably 20% at the most use an independent hearing officer or a subset of the board. So a couple of board members, as opposed to the entire board, could be appointed in order to hear the expulsion. I think that the question about how many of those are being appealed to DPI, and the majority of those who are being appealed to DPI may not be those that involve the independent hearing officer, primarily because a lot of the appeals, not the successful appeals, but a lot of the appeals have to do with what you just mentioned, and that is a pupil coming into a room like this and seeing their neighbor, or seeing a former teacher of theirs, or seeing their ex-boyfriend's parent. And walking into a room like that and wondering whether the information that your child is telling you, or wondering if the information that you have about the child from these other connections is weighing or is a factor in the decision that you're making regarding expulsion. I think that happens a lot more when you're dealing with a school board making that decision than the independent hearing officer. So I would say, yes, I think you're absolutely right. Most school districts do not use an independent hearing officer. That said, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think that you guys make that decision, as I mentioned before, you make that decision every year. And you may decide at some point not to hire an independent hearing officer and do it yourself, which is perfectly fine. I've got a lot to do. I'd be happy to help you in other ways. In addition, in a lot of situations where the school board is the one making the expulsion decision, the school board would have counsel sit with them and help them run the hearing in order to make sure that all of these procedures that we talked about before are followed. In some cases, that is not your normal legal counsel who is assisting the administration on presenting the case, or creating the notice of expulsion hearing, or otherwise answering questions about the process, so that you would reserve someone else outside of your regular legal counsel and his or her firm to assist you. So, certainly there are other ways in which you and I could work together, as well as other ways that you could run your expulsion hearings.
Would you give an example or two how a board has maybe modified your order?
How a board has modified my
Has that ever happened?
I'm trying to think of how. I don't believe that it's happened to me personally. I do know situations. There was a case that occurred a couple of years ago where an expulsion was not issued, and it was involving the Madison Metropolitan School District, and this case went to the Court of Appeals, and an expulsion was not issued. And the board in Madison said, no, we'd like to issue an expulsion, despite the fact that the hearing officer concluded that an expulsion wasn't proper under the circumstances. The Court of Appeals said that in that situation, it is not proper for the school board to modify an order that was never issued. So, that's kind of an interesting situation, that if I were to meet with your administration and meet with your student and go through the entire hearing process and conclude that expulsion is not proper under the circumstances, it would never come to you. But there are situations where the length of the expulsion might be modified. If I've got the expulsion through the 21st birthday and you guys decide that you'd like to, the student is young enough that you'd like to lift the expulsion, right before the senior year, that's a way that it could be modified. It could be modified in terms of one of the conditions that are included in the order you just simply don't appreciate. Maybe this is a situation where, after looking at what the student has been accused of, what the student has been proven to have done, that one of the conditions just doesn't seem fair to you. You have every right to eliminate that condition from the expulsion order through your modification. Or you could read the whole thing and say, you know what, Shana got it wrong this time. This child shouldn't have been expelled, and you could reverse the entire thing.
One of the things I think that I noticed, and I think others did too, between your expulsion order and Hill's expulsion order, is that Hill's expulsion order had kind of the context, the circumstances the person was trying to come into a location, a game, say, or something like that, and this happened, the officer did this and that, and yours had none of that context. It had simply, it was kind of the facts, ma'am, that type of thing. Is that a style difference? Or what he's doing is nice to have but unnecessary? Is that?
I think a little of both. I think the situation that we were dealing with was pretty cut and dry with regard to the expulsion hearing that we just did, and I obviously don't want to get into the details, but there was not a lot of dispute. It was pretty cut and dry. It was, there were things that were said that were not elaborated on because they didn't need to be elaborated on. Certainly, as we talked about before, you have access to all of the exhibits as well as the transcript if you want to look for that context. If you are telling me that you'd like to see more of that, that's certainly not something substantive that I would be uncomfortable with you saying, Shana, I'd like to see a little bit more context in your findings of fact. I'd be happy to oblige that. I'm an independent hearing officer, but I do work for you in the sense of I have to give you what you need in order to effectively review my orders. And so to the extent you want a little bit more detail, I'm happy to take that under advisement.
Good. Thank you.
All right, any further questions? All right, thank you. I was remarking, I think I've been 8-9 years on this board and seen Joe Hill's recommendations and I don't think I ever met him. So I don't recall ever meeting him. So
they're real live bodies.
That's right.
And as I said before, when you mentioned that to me, he's a lovely man. He's a very lovely man. I've met him several times, and he's a great guy.
So yes, so I appreciate you coming in so we get a chance to meet you before we start working together.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good presentation.
All right, skipping back on the agenda to item G, which would be the recognition.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have anything this evening? Okay.
No one's done anything noteworthy.
Well, there's lots of noteworthy. Again, the intention is that as our principals are intended to recognize the people and students in their building, and with being, what's going on with this week with student service and so on, we don't have most of our principals with us tonight, but we certainly will have more on a regular occasion.
Are we football
Susan?
team? Football team?
Football.
Conference? They just... Yeah, is that right? Football team, just one conference?
Yes.
Yes. And then again, I think it's appropriate to, as a district, to recognize Dick Rundle and his loss to this district. And the amazing thing was to, again, particularly if you have a history in this community, is to see the list of accomplishments that this person did in relation to this school. And so I just, again, want to say something out loud about that. And then let me show you this really neat thing. And I have to tell you, it sounds like it's about me, and I don't mean this to be about me. It's just because I think it's really neat, and because we have a community engagement committee, I think this is a really good idea, and I would say it would be worth perpetuating. So this is actually an award that I just got. I was walking into the funeral, and one of the main booster people said, "Oh, we have this for you. We want you to have it." And it's the Susan Manning Monona Grove Football Partnership 2015. And so one of the things that I mentioned to Dan as I came in, that as we do recognitions, I think as we look at that committee and think about as a board about how we want to do that committee, one of the things we may want to do is formalize recognition of partnerships. The other thing is that when we look at the Community Herald, we look at, I really appreciate that you have agendized recognitions, because I think it's really neat. It makes us think about what neat things have happened in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But I think it's really important that each and every one of us look for these things and again, bring them back to the board and to the community. They're always the unsung heroes, we know that. But actually, the superintendent had his picture in the Herald on the walk to school day at Monona. Did you get your picture? Were you dressed up? Did you go in the parade today, Carrie?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking about the Herald Independent and Dan's picture in there. I was at the Cottage Grove School Parade today. I had the day off of work.
And they did the Winnequa this
I wasn't sure it fit into the category of recognitions, however.
It depends upon what you wore. No. Anyway, I just think, again, building partnerships and recognition of partnerships, and when I think of some of the really exemplary things that we've done as a district with our energy and McKinstry and our work with PMA and the work that Jared's done with setting up open enrollment plans, I just, again, encourage each and every one of us to bring something back as we see it. We saw, Susan and I watched Lauren Homburg and Leslie Goff do a fundraiser for Second Harvest this weekend using their incredible music talents. And then we also were able to observe a wonderful show with Tatiana Naherniak, who will be going to New York in 2 weeks. Again, a Monona Grove graduate, absolutely incredible talent and skill. And the whole family actually did part of the program. So we should feel really good about the things we do.
Another one is the community service provided by the MG21 kids, the senior center, and the library.
Yes. Yep. Again, if you think about it during the time between the meetings, I'm sure you'll have that experience. And actually, DECA is out recognizing DECA for going out, and
I think it's DECA.
we think it's DECA.
Collecting food for.
They're coming out, the food drive?
Swan Stevens Food Drive.
Anyway. Neat things kids are doing.
Thank you. Moving on to item I, which is, item 8, correspondence and announcements. Is there nothing?
Don't believe we have anything.
Okay. Item I, the administrative reports, starting with the superintendent's report.
All right, I have one item tonight that I wanted to bring to your attention, and the Smiles for Life program. I may have mentioned it briefly last year, but we just completed our first full year of that partnership. Speaking of partnerships, and this is a wonderful one. It's not a community-based one. It's more of a statewide network. So I have attached on the board docs some factual information about what Smile for Life program is. It's a nonprofit, and it doesn't cost us a dime. They come in, and it's wonderful that they can provide dental hygiene services to our students. Is actually an organization I'd worked with in my previous district. They contacted me here, and my only role in it was to set up one meeting with our principals, and they did all the work from there. And the report back that I've gotten is it's been worked really well. They're very understanding of schools and schedules and how they schedule the students in. And on there, the thing that I really wanted to share with you was the data on how many students were served. I apologize, the last page got turned sideways on the board docs. But you see that we had 242 students served in our district last year. And if you look at that, 200 pizza, there are actually 112 of different students. And there's also some data compared to the other Dane County schools. And we had the second largest number of students served amongst that group. So again, just another one of the many things that we have going on and another opportunity to provide service for our kids.
Well, Dan, I might recommend, and I don't know how that would work, and Jeff is listening, that would be a wonderful article for the community newspaper to cover those kinds of services.
I'm with Susan. I think we have an article a week about something we're doing well.
Well, I know Jeff is working, he's really been regulating
Yeah,
that, but,
that's really good.
yeah.
Variety of things, and that's a good approach.
Yeah, I was very happy to see this. It's great. Thank you.
Okay, item J, the committee board reports, starting with the Personnel Committee. Dean?
Yeah, I handed out my assignment here to you. Personnel Committee. My wife proofread this, and she says, I thought the board meetings are going to be twice a month. Personnel, bang, bang, bang.
Mm-hmm.
And
Meeting
so
twice
I
a week.
I thought I'd get that one in. I thought I would get that in before Jennifer did tonight. We did meet on October 15th. I tried to get it all on the page, didn't quite work. We met to collectively bargain for the 15-16 salary, and we agreed to meet again. And I didn't including so many details because nothing got particularly advanced at the meeting. Then we met on the 27th, and we met with an administrator regarding adjustment to retirement proposal. But I think the important thing is that we note that the post-retirement benefits for our administrators are kind of modeled on the general framework that the one for our teachers is here. We met on October 28th. I think that was last night. And this is probably not only the board's but the MGEA's request that we look at modification changes in the handbook. And prior to the meeting, they had submitted 9 items for amendments to the handbook, and I suggested that we kind of maybe begin discussion 3 at a time on that, and you can see down below the 3 that we talked about. One was an amendment to assure that additive contracts are issued at the same time as teaching contracts. I think everybody agreed this is a desirable goal. Dan indicated he would address the matter and report back to the committee. It's really not an amendable item, probably to the handbook. It's just a task that has to be addressed, I guess. We spent most of our time going over the issue of personal leave, and currently the handbook provides for 3 days of personal leave. I won't have to read all this, but we talked all about the discussion really bored in on permission as opposed to just taking it personal leave. We pointed out that what's in there was in the old collective bargaining agreement, but there are some issues here. We're going to get some data on. We have a database now that we didn't have when we did the original handbook, and I think we'll be able to come back and identify any issues, problems, or concerns with that. And you ought to note, out of those 9 items, I think there's 4 of them that have to do with leave of some sort. And then there was an amendment on how we amend the handbook, to whether that belongs in the handbook or not, I don't know, but there was a 1-page proposal submitted to it. We didn't really discuss that, but the committee, the board members on the committee will deliberate on that process at a later time. And they also, while it was not a handbook issue, the concern was raised about the specialist teacher compensation plan and where is it and so forth. And I think I got this right, Dan, that I think your comments were that it's basically only October, and this is a year-long process to get that done, but we were reminded that it has to get done. So that's my report.
Thank you, Dean. Susan?
Yeah, I just have one question related to that last piece. There's not actually a committee doing this.
Correct.
Is the plan to get together each sort of category of specialists? Like you mentioned the school psychs last night, but there's also guidance counselors.
Yeah. So
Some of the special ed people in that.
Yeah. So what we're doing is because each of those groups are many of them very small for as number
Right,
of teachers
they are.
there, we are actually meeting with every
Okay.
individual group, and so
Okay.
that basically every teacher will have an opportunity to have input, gathering that, and then from there, administrative, at least we kind of collect our thoughts about the direction we want to go. So when we come back to the committee, say here's some things to consider, and then we'll take it from there. So.
And
Okay.
I think when it comes back to it, it'll come back to personnel, but we'd like to have you join us because you've been in this mix since the beginning, too.
Yeah, with the compensation piece,
Yeah, it's a compensation piece, and
Yeah, and I guess you probably have sort of a time frame, but when those meetings will be done, and then when it'll come back,
Yeah.
and because I understand their worry that the year will get away
Sure.
from us and nothing will.
Yeah, no, I think it's real important. I'm glad to share that timeline. That's one of the tasks we have for Scott Brown before he leaves, to finish those meetings.
Well, I was hoping that too, because I know he had a lot of thoughts
Yeah.
on it, so.
And so he
Good.
will,
Okay, perfect.
basically leave with compiling this information that
Okay.
we can then move forward.
That'll be helpful, thanks.
Yeah.
Item 2, the policy committee report. Susan?
The policy committee met on October 21st, and we've added a process at the beginning of every agenda where we will check on whether revisions that we made in the meetings, we make revisions and notes get taken, and then they go off to get sent in. It was pointed out that we really should check those again before there's any final thing done with them. So we've actually made that into an agenda item. And we did find a few in the series that we'd already done, the 0, 0, 0s through into the 3000s, that did need some minor corrections, and in some cases, some substantive things where maybe they just didn't all get caught. So in those cases, we could bring those back and finalize them. And then after doing that, we continued working on the 3000 series, which relates to professional staff. And I thought we'd finish it this week, but we didn't because we had these other things. So we will finish them, I'm pretty sure, by the next meeting on the 3rd. And then once those are done, and I think we need to do the same process, though, have that check-in again to make sure appropriate changes have been made, then we will plan to pass them off to the personnel committee so you guys can take a look at them. We do plan to try to bring the 000 series, which is the board bylaws, to the board at the November 11th meeting for a first read. We did take to heart, I think Dee mentioned that getting the entire manual would be a bit overwhelming, and even though, so with your agreement, and that series, the bylaws, does stand alone pretty well. The others, not so much, but if you literally just look at what you have and reserve your questions to just what's there and not say, this is missing, that's missing, where is that? Because it does all hang together and they come up in different policies. That's the only hard thing about looking at it separately. But it makes some sense to me. So we hope to start off with that series in November. And then when that comes to you, it will be accompanied by a document explaining any substantive changes from current policy, because again, that's the only section of the policy manual that does kind of correlate with our 100 series, so you can see what those changes were, and then we'll get input on that and either take action on the 24th, or if you want to send it back to us, we'll see where that goes. Also, just a reminder that you can attend any of the meetings, but we meet at 5:30 to 7:30, usually on the first Wednesday of the month. We've been trying to cram in extra meetings because we're trying to move a little bit faster, but I don't know that we'll continue to do that. So pay attention to, I guess I would encourage you to look at our agendas, and if there are specific policies that you have a particular interest in, feel free to come to the meeting and listen, and then at the end, if you have some questions, we could see if there are questions, because maybe we could deal with them ahead of time before it comes to the vote. And that's all.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, next, we had 4 members, Dean, Susan, and Jennifer attended the WASB Employment and School Law Seminar. Do you have any comments about your experience? Who wants to start? Jennifer. Jennifer has.
Quick visual.
Yes, that's
Quick visual. A hefty folder per day, I'm telling you. I, in all seriousness, I again felt that the quality of the talks, of the presentations was quite good. Some people were more talkative than others. Some were more direct than others. All of that, but especially as a new board member, this information is especially helpful, and the fact that we're in this kind of continual state of flux and trying to understand, what policies and procedures and steps we should be taking. And it's always good to be able to talk with other districts, other board members from other districts. I find those conversations to be very rich and very helpful. So I especially was interested in the teacher compensation sessions. That was really my highest area of interest. The other pieces were equally, I don't, you walk out and your brain's kind of this big, right? So it was good. It was good. I'm glad I went.
Anyone else?
I only went one day on the Friday, and attended one on role of unions and Municipal Employees Relations Act in Post Act 10 School District Environment, recent developments in employment discrimination law and the role of the school board, and then complaint procedure and chain of command. And I was particularly interested in that last one, just because I'd heard some things on the others before. But it's sort of a newer area for policy, and we have developed a policy related to this, and I just copied a few of the slides. I don't know if I'm looking at them for Jeff, but it just talked about the need to spell out, to have defined, we've had a lot of conversations about board communication with staff and staff communication with board, and then when there are concerns, how those should be brought to the board, and the fact that most of them generally should be brought to staff long before they come to the board. So formalizing it in policy is something that we're doing, and this was the first WASB presentation I'm aware of where they really talked about this, and I just highlighted a couple slides. There's more to it. I think that even if you didn't go to this, that you can go to the WASB website after the fact, and you can access these materials, or whether you went to it or not. I think you can access it if you want to see the whole thing. Or if you want to see the whole slideshow on this, I would print it off for you. Barry Forbes did this one. So it just talked about the benefits of having a clear defined chain of command, in that if employees do go through their supervisors and then up through the district office staff and the superintendent, the district administration has a chance to investigate and deal with issues, whereas when they come right to the board, they really don't. It undercuts and undermines our administrative staff, and that's one of the main concerns about that. And then in terms of just the resolution of things, it's much easier to resolve these things when we follow these procedures. So, and the other part related to grievance process, kind of same thing, that it's unfair to staff members too, because as we just heard with the expulsion hearing, if there's a student involved in expulsion, they come into a room and they see a couple board members that were their neighbors, or that they don't know what the people think of them, and there's that issue. Well, similarly, some teachers have relationships with certain board members, not with other board members, and some teachers don't have relationships with any of us. So it isn't fair to the staff members either when the individual staff members take advantage of those friendships that they have with some of us individually and come to us. That's just another good reason to follow proper procedure and have a real protocol in place and stick to it. And then also to make sure that anything we hear always goes to the superintendent so that he's aware of what the concerns are and issues are, otherwise he can't deal with them. So I thought it was very helpful, and I was pleased to see it laid out that way, because in policy committee, we'd already talked about some of these things, and the rationale was very strong, and I thought very clearly presented. So yeah, similarly, another good session, always good side conversations with what's going on in the district, so valuable.
Thank you, Susan.
I actually attended on Thursday. I have meetings in Boston on Friday. The pre-seminar that was the key work of school boards was extremely well done, and I actually did bring handouts back for all of you, which I think is still packed in my Boston bag, but I will bring it because it was really well done. But the goal and the theme of what they were talking about is that the research clearly shows that the better the board, the better the district students perform. So that's really interesting research. So I think that's a challenge to us, particularly in light of the school perception results, to be a good board, because that's an obligation we have to, according to research, have our students perform better. So I thought that was really interesting, and I actually enjoyed that a lot more than I thought I was going to. I thought it was really good. And then that afternoon they did a program on discrimination issues, which was also excellent, and I would also recommend that you see that. They specifically went through discrimination issues in relation to students with disabilities, which I thought was very helpful to hear and have somebody review for us. So I would encourage you, if you get a chance to hear one of those workshops, that you go. Then they also did a compliance with open meetings laws. And I thought that was also helpful, because often we'll have a theme or a rule or a guideline, and we think we're on it and we're a little off. So there were several questions that related to some things that we do. One specifically was about agendizing the items under the superintendent report, which we are now doing. But they went on to say that if in fact you're going to have a discussion on that item, so let's say Dan puts report out on the long-range planning committee, and we have all kinds of questions about the configurations, what they say is, in that event, then you need to put it on the agenda for discussion, you know. Again, just talking about things that sometimes happen that aren't planned, but, and then the last part of that day was pupil records, which was also very good, but I thought the key work of school boards, plus they have a new edition of the key work of school boards, and they strongly recommend that all board members have a copy of that. And then they recommended doing the survey. So that was helpful, thank you.
Just a comment related to that. We did give the new key work of school boards to the 2 new board members, and some of the rest of us
We could
haven't.
probably.
So we've made that part of the orientation.
Is that
packets.
discriminatory? No.
No, it's part of the orientation packet, is what I'm saying.
But we should
And
all have one. That's what they said
I have
to
2,
us.
so if somebody wants one of mine.
Okay, I'll
they
take
can
it.
have one of mine.
What they said was, because it's an updated version, and I think I
Right.
have 3 of the old
Yeah,
ones,
right. Might be worth
to
doing
make sure you have
updated.
the new one, because it's a good tool.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Dean, did you have something?
Well, I'll probably break the euphoria of wonderful. I thought it was one of the poorest WASB workshops.
We may have been at different workshops, different
Okay,
sections.
that may be true.
Different tracks.
Let me get my bullet points in, ma'am. And no, I thought I said in about 3 sessions in which I thought the presenters were poorly prepared. Their slides are unrelated to the handouts, and terrible presenters, I thought. And I thought some of the topics were very good, and I think the individual interactions with other board members were good. But I was very disappointed in the quality of the presenters. I think the topics were good. Often the handouts, if you'd have gotten the handout and could left and didn't have to, and there's one presenter that we get very frequently. I just can't do that one anymore. But it's a I'm sorry to destroy the celebration. But
Pardon me. That was
All right. Thank you. Any other comments? All right, then moving on to new business. I'm sorry, unfinished business, item 1, which is K, which is the short and long-term budget forecasts. Jared?
So this is a continuation of some great news that we didn't discuss regarding budgets. At each of your spots, I did finally get an opportunity to put together some information that will continue to assist us in the conversation. And it is also uploaded on Board Docs, Jeff. It's the board information, October 28th. So I just want to sort of walk through this. Obviously understand that you're just getting it right now, so the purpose of it is for me just to walk through it. If any questions come up, definitely be more than happy to answer those, but then this will continue our conversation in case there's additional information that I need to put together for you. I want to start out and just talk about enrollment trends. One of the things that when we talk about revenue and expenditures for a school district, enrollment is such a driving factor, not only due to the fact that we need to staff for class size and our enrollment, but also the way that school districts are funded is largely on enrollment. And so this first graph that I have here is an enrollment that that shows our total actual enrollment. I'm not breaking it down by FT, so it's not our 4Ks that are being counted as a 0.6. This is actually kids in our seats on the third Friday. So I went all the way back to 2007 and 2008. The gray line here is actual total number of students in there. That would include our residents and our open enrolled. The blue line is our residents that are in seats, and then the orange line at the bottom of the graph is our open enrollment. And I think this graph signifies that the district has worked very hard, that when we saw a decline in our residential enrollment, that we saw a pickup in our open enrollment to sort of fill those seats so we can continue to offer the programs that we're doing. And I'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about the revenue advantage that we do get for open enrollment. So as you see that we're starting to see our residents growth come back, so we're not accepting as many new ones as we have in the past. But you'll definitely see that when there's this dip down here in the blue area, you're seeing there's an increase in our open enrollments. And then just down below that is actually giving you the numbers, because sometimes graph is nice visual, but actually looking at what those are. So you'll see that if you look at the open enrollment and back in 2007, 8, we started with 85, and this year we're at a total of 342. Now 342, you might say, well, if our residents are going up, why do we have 342 students? Well, if you look at the previous year, we had 309, so that's really less than 40, and that's because once our board policy states that once a student is enrolled through open enrollment, we have dedicated it and we're going to educate them until they are no longer, until they graduate or decide to go back to the resident districts. The next is...
Quick question on that one.
Yes.
The 342, you threw out a number which I've emailed you on. We had 349 non-resident students. The 342 are open enrollment.
Well,
and there's 7 others?
So the 342 is actually, so what we do is our enrollment is fluctuating sometimes on a daily basis. So 342 is the official count that we turned into DPI. We have alternate open enrollment, so after the third Friday counts, we might have additional kids. So the 349 is where we're really at today. But to really take a point in time to be able to compare apples to apples in data, I've chosen the third Friday count. So that's why it's 342. So right now we're at 349 for total.
When you use the term non-resident, do you mean open enrollment?
So non-resident means open enrollment or families that are here on tuition waivers, which would mean that they were in our school district and then they moved out after the open enrollment period, so they get that one free year, and then they have to apply for open enrollment. But all these students that are here, the district does receive additional revenue for. So I will talk about a little bit later.
And then does that include the 1066?
Yes, and these would include the 1066, the 6603 students. Yep. Our MG21 students that we have coming in, any tuition paid students. This next graph, I think, is definitely a very important thing to keep in mind as we look at budgets. I need to shrink my screen here. Especially as we look at the expenditure side of things. We're seeing our growth, which is in the gray, continue to increase. But what we're seeing is an increase in our economically disadvantaged families that we're serving, and which ultimately then decreases the number of non-academic. But this is just showing you the enrollment breakdown and applying the economic disadvantaged portion over it. So we're seeing an increase in that. So additional services potentially could be required.
Jared, is that distributed evenly across all the schools, or are there more littler kids? If that
I don't know that
trend
off the
is
top of
changing.
my head. I would definitely say that there in some of our elementary schools, when we look at Title I, and that's largely based on free and reduced, not all of our elementary schools apply or are qualified. For example, we have Winnequa is our elementary school, and then GDS. And so when you look at that, but they're also looking as a whole as a district. So not knowing that data off the top of my head,
That's
but I definitely can get that information but assist in the decision making. The next area here is very similar to the previous graph, but this is specifically free and reduced applications of students that are in the district. So you'll see in the orange the overall enrollment, and you'll see that over these number of years we've continued to see an increase in free and reduced students that are in our district.
Has that criteria changed?
The only thing that would change is the income levels, the brackets, but I can't tell you exactly what that change would have been. But typically what happens is the federal government makes those adjustments.
And this is another one where I think I've heard that, and I wanted to know if this is correct. Students and families apply for this, so it might mean that this is underrepresented of students who are actually eligible?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's there's two matters. A family can qualify by filling out an application, or we can do the direct certification, so which means that we do get a list from the state, but those families would be either in the foster care program or receiving additional state services.
Thank you.
But definitely, this doesn't say that we're hitting everybody. There, obviously families that have to make those decisions have to make decisions to apply. So. The next here is sort of hard to do that here. So if you look at your handout, I think this is very interesting. It's one of the things that I pulled this from the DPI website, especially when we start talking about potential additional revenue sources or expenditures or going to a referendum. There's going to be data that starts to surface and it's talked about. But this first top portion of this is actually our revenue by per pupil. And so it goes back to 2002, 2007, 2008. And if you look at that, that's $13,643. And 2013-14, which is the most current data that they have at DPI, is $13,737. So realistically, that's a $94 increase over 6 years. And if you think of how much our health insurance has increased by a family, it's $6,384. So we talk about enrollment, and yes, as our district continues to grow, you might see that we're starting to see a little bit more revenue, but when you're only seeing a $94 increase over a number of years, but when you look on the bottom of this page and you're looking at expenditures, we're seeing going from $13,624 up to $14,008. I mean, we've seen on the educational side only a 4% increase in our cost. And so if you look at up here, this is just breaking down the educational cost. So that's taking all the stuff that's in Fund 10, so our instructional staff, salaries and benefits, and it's taking pupil services, student services, buildings and grounds, administration, and getting that educational cost. And then it pulls out transportation costs, it pulls out school nutrition, it pulls out the cost of our facilities, which would be the debt service that we need to pay. So when you're really looking at that, we're only seeing on the educational side of it a 4% increase over 6 years. And we're only getting a $94 increase per student, which is less than 1% over 6 years. So we're sort of seeing that picture, sort of that perfect storm come together when we talk about, why are our expenditures, why are we potentially looking at an $851,000 fund balance dip this year? Is because of the way that finances are been set up for school districts.
Could you tell me what the rate of inflation would have been over that time?
Well, if you look at just the average, some years it's a little lower, but an average over those 6 years that I took, it averages about 2.07% annually.
Compounding then over
Compounding
every
then
year,
over,
right?
yes.
Okay,
So.
thank you.
Then, as we talked about before, and we talked about at the annual meeting and the budget hearing, is how really the district receives its revenues, and is through the revenue limits, which was put into law a number of years ago, really to cap, if the districts could collect in revenue. So that combination includes our third Friday counts, and it's a rolling 3-year average. But this graph shows that since 2004-05 to our current year, you can see that big dip here in the middle was during the years that we received our 5.5 reduction in revenue limits. And before that, typically what happened is annually in the state budgets, the district received a per pupil increase that was tied to the CPI. And so you can see it was just that continuous, so to match inflation, increased standard of living. Then we got the decrease, and then they took the inflation concept out, and they had given us a small dollar amount.
I want to correct that. If it's only going up, increase as inflation, that's not increasing the standard of living.
I'm sorry. Yes, you're correct. So we're really just following CPI.
That's right.
And so then there was the decrease during the time of Act 10 that they took 5.5% away, which actually was $606 per student for us. And we still have not recovered from that through our revenue limits. And this is just revenue limits with exemptions that apply to if we had transfer of service. So this takes out, our energy efficiency borrowing that we've done. This is money that physically goes into the classroom or Fund 10 or Fund 27. When you look at our overall revenue limits, this graph is just up a little bit, but that's including debt service, Fund 80, which is our community service fund. But you'll also notice that after the dip, this has really sort of flattened out. It hasn't allowed any type of increases that have been significant to keep up with say a 9% health insurance, utility cost increases, in addition to as our student enrollment increases. Typically your FTEs need to increase to keep class sizes at 86 per board policy.
Excuse me. When you on that chart you just had up there, when you use the term revenue, does that mean state and local?
So this would be state and local. This would be the maximum that the district could collect between property taxes and equalization. So what they do is they take our enrollments.
So it's equalization aid and property taxes and special ed funding.
And this wouldn't be any special ed
No,
funding.
no.
Special ed funding would be outside of this. But this is really what they're saying is that if you take
General purpose revenue.
General purpose revenue, yes. The next graph here just shows.
Let me ask one more thing. Would this chart look slightly more dramatic if we showed simply state revenue as opposed to local and state combined?
I don't necessarily think you're going to see. You're going to see some peaks and valleys. You're going to see some years because of what we've seen with the way funding has been. One year we might see an increase in state aid, and the next year it drops down, which makes it challenging. But we definitely, if you look at special education funding, that has been a continuous downward trend. We might have some more costs in there, so when you look at the overall, but typically, when I sort of got back into this about 10 years ago, we were up 33% per dollar. We're at 26% per dollar. So really 26 cents per dollar that we spend in special education, we're actually receiving back. The remaining of that's coming from Fund 10 that we're transferring over.
And just remind you, that number was up to as high as 68% at one time.
Yeah.
So it's continuously been declining. So this graph here.
If you'd flip back one.
Yep.
I just wanted to mention that you asked about inflation, Carrie. Over this chart, relative in constant dollars, this represents a 10% cut over the length of the time.
I was trying to reconcile that, thank you.
chart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
11% actually.
This graph just shows our Fund 10 and 27 revenue, and just more of an opportunity for you guys to have as data, but it's broken down by revenue from local sources, from other school districts, from immediate sources, from the state, federal, and then other finances. But if you look at the graph here, this is actually taking the total revenue that we receive in Fund 10 and Fund 27 and dividing it by the actual students that are in our districts, including both residents and open enrollment that are physically attending. This is what our graph looks like for the revenue per students attending. Number of years, we've been declining. We've sort of you've seen that change a little bit, and that's just because we're starting to see some growth in our 3-year averages coming. It's not giving us lots of additional revenue, but it's that when we're still below what we received back in 2009, 2010. And I can
How
tell
do
you
our total
costs are not the same as 2009, 2010.
How do our total costs compare to, is there another chart on that, compared to state and other districts?
I haven't put anything in for comparison of the state averages
Okay.
or other districts. This is just looking at us as enrollment growth and where we've been at.
Okay.
So talking about non-resident student revenue, and this is definitely an area that you hear about, people talk about, especially as we sort of walk through this long-range facility planning, is the concept of, well, if we did have these non-residents attending our districts, we would have space. Right now, if we looked at this year, we're looking at $2,195,000 of additional revenue that we're receiving. Now, granted that when you do have some additional students, that it could require some additional FT, but these students are not all in the same location. They're spread out through the district. So back in 2007-08, we've just continued to see that increase in revenue. So as we've lost revenue from residents having smaller resident growth or a decline in residents, we've been able to pick up some additional revenue to continue offering the programs that we have. But keeping in mind that we have went through significant budget reductions of 1.2 million, just over 800,000, just shy of 800,000. Those are things that have significantly impacted our students and our staff, but we were able to, tap into some additional revenue through non-resident students attending. Fund 1027, this is on the expenditure side, so this is very similar to that bar graph that I showed on the revenue, but this is our expenditures. It just gives you everything broken down by object, which is salaries, benefits, purchase services, non-capital equipment, capital items, debt service that fall within Fund 10 or 27. So those are your lease payments, insurance judgments, insurance and judgments, and transfers from Fund 10 over to Fund 27, Fund 38, or Fund 50. But as you look at that, and I know it's hard to read in front of the audience, but one of the things that our principals and our staff will tell you is that if you look at our capital objects, that has continuously declined. Those are those big items that like replacement of band equipment, replacement of desks and chairs. Those have declined because of the budget issues that we've experienced. We have maintained to try to put those in other areas, and so that's just one thing that I wanted to point out. But this just shows you that on the next page is broken out by, sorry, Peter?
I'm sorry, you broke it up. Okay, go ahead.
This one down here is just showing you on salary and benefits. I think it's, since 75 to 80% of our budget is salary and benefits. If you look at the blue line here, which is our salary line, that's pretty flat. For when you think about trying to compensate our employees fairly, having increased FTE because of student growth, this line is pretty flat. And then if you look at our benefit side, there's just one little dip, and that dip is when Act 10 came in. And by state statute in Act 10, our district was impacted by requiring our employees to contribute 12.6% of their health insurance because we belong to the state plan. And we had to only contribute WRSR portion, it wasn't the whole entire portion. So when you look at the blue line, our salary line is pretty flat, but when you look at the take-home pay for our staff, there's a dip, because we're still not at that point of recovering from the 12.6 for the portion of WRS.
Are OPEB funds included in these lines?
Yes, they are. This one just here breaks out health insurance a little bit more specifically. It shows you that it just goes back to when we had the 12.6%, and as we have that continued inflation of health insurance, we just continue to see that increase. This graph is sometimes misleading due to the fact that when you have turnover, we might see a 8 to 9% increase in health insurance, but when you have staff turnover, they might come in and only need single insurance, and the previous person needs family insurance, or there's changes in spouse that they might switch over to different health insurance. But this is our overall budget for health insurance in the district.
That includes retirees?
This includes retirees. Now going back to the revenue limit side of things, and this is actually including those exemptions, so this would include the energy efficiency one. We're still, even though we've been able to look at some additional financing outside of our revenue limit to do some upgrades in our capital projects, and we're still seeing that very small. We're not back over 2009 or 2010-11 mark, and we have more students than we did back then. And then when we look at the levy rates, obviously when we talk about making wise decisions and how we spend our money, and just what we've seen here is that the district has worked very hard in seeing that levy rate has decreased. Yes, we have seen some additional state aid, but we've also been able to refinance our debts that has saw some significant savings. And that's the end of those. That new information that I had provided. Additional information that was carried over from the previous one was our forecast looking forward, and we're looking at like $850,000 to $900,000 deficit moving forward, and how we want to take care of meeting that. Does the board or does the district need to look at additional reductions based on the reductions that we've had in the past? Other opportunities such as referendum, or how we want to move forward. So.
Thank you. Questions? Needs a picture, doesn't it?
Very well put together, thank you.
And I do apologize that you just got it tonight, so.
I'll just add one comment. Today I had an opportunity to give a presentation to the Monona East Madison Optimist Club, and I gave a little bit more of a broader presentation, but I definitely touched on the budget piece as well. And I didn't have all of these slides are updated. I had some of the information that Jared had presented at the annual meeting, and is still able to kind of paint the broad picture about where we're at historically and currently with our budget challenges. And I can say that the feedback I got from that group, and there were about 25 individuals there today. The majority of them, many of them Monona residents, but many with Monona ties. Very much, it was eye-opening to a number of them. They understood, the challenges, but they get some of the specific information. So I think the point of me saying that is, as we get this more detailed information out and start having, to the community and look at that the longitudinal data historically, people are going to understand that. It's pretty clear, what our budget issues are. And so clearly, as we talk about how we're going to solve this issue, budget reductions versus the opportunity for perhaps a referendum, that's what we need to talk about, and very soon. In fact, I think even some discussion tonight would be relevant about how we're addressing this. But we got to start really proactively telling the story about where we're at.
Susan?
I would strongly support that.
It's okay.
Sorry. That's
I would just support that.
Yeah.
I was just going to mention that a couple of us are going tomorrow to a meeting, the Wisconsin Public Education Network, and I sent you all some information from them today, but a meeting in DeForest to kind of talk about this with other various school districts in the area, what people are facing and how they're dealing with it. And so it's just been more of an informational session, but also a kind of, do we have some ideas for getting this out to the broader community?
Yeah, and so for instance, one of the things Dan does is he reports out every month to kind of an education government group for the Monona Chamber. And again, I think that's a great opportunity to take several of these pieces of this handout and bring that with us. And just, put it up and do it in 3 minutes as part of the report, because I think it's really important as we start to have these numbers in a clearly visible, understandable, in those kind of materials. Those are opportunities for places to get out. So I think it's also helpful for us as board members to look for that, because we wouldn't think about necessarily doing it in that environment, but if it's short and it's just a few slides, I think you're reaching a lot of people that way.
Steve?
I think this, maybe you're going to get to it, but these 3 sheets on summarizing the cuts, which we've been here, we all kind of know what the general numbers were. My arithmetic says that's $2.5 million over the last 5 years, right? And it's those dollars would change the slope of some of those lines, I think, on that. Susan, you know that because the big one there, the $1.2 million, I think, was the one where you had the community involvement.
Right. The other thing that might be relevant, if you want to take it out and post it when you're actually doing this, are the impact statements, because those are really impressive. And that's one of the reasons these decisions were made. So you could take these cuts and just the impact statements on these cuts so that the community can understand, you may have changed custodial services, but that means there are different people in the building than usual at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, it's just...
Yeah, I would only add to that, I think that's a good point. That's something we talked about, and how to communicate all this. I think those should be redone and done in more written form, because it's a huge binder.
Oh, yeah.
I
agree.
I would not put that, I would not repost that, but it's a time factor. If somebody volunteered to go through and kind of rewrite some of them so they're more legible and easy to see, then that is a piece of the loss, because that is, again, one of the things that we talked about a lot, and we got feedback that this was the case, that parents and some community members didn't really feel that 1.2 million because we did it so well and so carefully, but staff felt it, and we were aware of what was going on. So explaining that, I think it wouldn't be bad to put a piece like that together, which I might be willing to work on.
Well, a perfect example is because our high school and our superintendent have been truly committed to trying to reach the goal on class size, even though we increased those class sizes because of that commitment, it hasn't been as dramatic an impact as it might have been by the allowance of, if you started running all the classes at 30, including your English classes and your math classes, there would be a significant impact on that, because they go for the goal. But again, tell a story.
Dean?
Well, I think if you read between the lines, you don't just look at totals, and you start to hit on what Susan's hitting in here, is that because each line tends to shift the topic a little bit, but there's many of those lines get into teaching and learning directly or indirectly, and I think those numbers will tell too. I think it tells 2 messages. One, we've tried to cut where it didn't impact teaching and learning, but it also tells the story that we had to impact some of that as well, despite other efforts.
Yes, you can't take...
Well, they're not categorized that way on these sheets,
Right.
but they could be.
But the impact statements, you could do that.
Well, that was one of the main criteria used for this, because we picked the ones that relatively minimally impacted teaching and learning. That was
Remember they prioritized
the most
that.
important criteria.
Good job, Karen.
Yeah, thank you.
It's just starters, though.
Just, I mean, one of the things we have to do is quantify, well, additional revenue, how would we spend it? What would we be preserving with it, essentially? That's the question. We have to think about that and articulate that. All right, moving on.
So what you're really saying is, we need to look at what we'd have to reduce if we don't have additional revenue.
I mean, we do
We're
have.
already in a deficit budget.
We can't say, well, we've had a 10% cut over 10 years, we need to do something about that. We have the public, a more specific answer, which is what we will use that additional revenue for.
Well, and I guess what I'm saying is, the flip side of that seems to me, then what would we cut if we don't get it, since
Yeah,
we're
that's
in a
right.
deficit budget?
That's
So
right.
if we don't get this money, what does that mean?
That's
It's
exactly.
kind of another way to phrase the same thing, that's all I was trying.
Well, where we put it, then that's
Well, again, I agree.
Carrie?
But when you say it, where would we put extra money? It makes it sound like, oh, we're gonna hire more art
No.
teachers or
Right,
something, and
that's
that's
what I
There
meant.
is no extra.
the way you're
I
saying
didn't
that
say
is not
where we
how
put it.
well,
Yeah,
I wouldn't
what-
use the word
what-
extra.
What would we do with,
but you know what I mean,
That's
that
the additional
dangerous
revenue
way
over.
to set that up, when really what we need to do is pay to keep the people that we would otherwise not be able
We would
to.
That's right.
maintain is the answer. So
That's
right.
yeah, so,
Yeah,
Right.
it's tricky.
Extra and
It's
additional are
tricky.
not words in Jared's going.
I mean, I think that's the other part that makes sure that we have that conversation about is that, if you do look at going to a operational referendum and you look at the next 5 years, and you say that, our deficit right now is $851,000. If you went and used that as your number, you're just maintaining. The district still is going to have to make some tough decisions. Not tough decisions that necessarily means that you're going to lay off individuals, but you're still going to have a balancing act of, okay, we went to our community, we've asked for this to maintain, but just with every year, we always have to look at a zero-based budgeting, and that's what we did this year. There's going to be years where there's going to be some additional needs that we might have to tap into our fund balance, and there's going to be decisions as, health insurance continues to increase by 9%, looking at, what do we need to do as a district and change that. And that's just being good stewards of the financial, situation that we have. But yet we can't just say, okay, well, we're just going to cut the $852 because you're going to continue to cut potentially, and you're going to have additional because you're going to see health insurance potentially increasing, or hopefully someday maybe decrease, but we're not there. So, I mean, looking at that, it's just maintain.
Well, and I think a good example is when we were out going to some of our regional workshops, one of the things they were talking about is when Act 10 went to the contribution to your health insurance, there were a lot of school districts at the time, and we talked to one that was already moving to a 25% payment from the staff toward their health insurance because of those types of increases. So again, I think it would behoove us to at some point take some time to sit down and say, okay, these are the things we've already done. These are the things that realistically we may have to do if we are not able to pass the operational referendum. So that people know if they say no, they know what the consequences of that decision are. You want to do this? Then this is what you're going to have. And we haven't really taken that step yet.
Susan?
I think it's important also to, whenever we talk about even potentially thinking about increasing the employee contribution to health insurance, that we make that very clear to people that this is a time when we're looking to pay for a teacher compensation plan. We're looking to try to find a way to increase our teachers' salaries. And if we go to trying to fix our budget by making them pay more in health insurance, we are reducing their take-home pay. And I'm going to tell you right now that it's
Absolutely.
not something I'm willing to vote for at this point.
That's why we didn't work on it. Some other district did, not us.
Right, but
Yeah.
yeah, I just think when the idea gets floated at a public meeting, I think it needs to be clear what the ramifications of that are, because when the public listens to that, it looks like it's an easy way to save some money, and it's just not an easy way to save money.
It's a disaster.
I agree. I think that's a really important point, and we need to build also into the conversation about our staffing needs and how much more challenging it's getting to hire staff and the teacher shortage. And to, that we keep talking all the time, attract and retain, the retaining piece is gonna become an issue if we don't do something. So, like Jared said, even to fill that hole to say maintain, well, we gotta define what that is. Maintaining is still not good. That's, like we talked about over this, 8-year period, we're still decreasing in what we're able to do.
I think it's also important when you get down to it, that all of the detail that we understand has to be converted into some simple, clear messages as well. Because it's nice if you get into a discussion, somebody wants to pursue it, but it has to do with impact, and because a lot of people, there's 75% of them out there don't have children in school, and a lot who do are doing just fine, because I think we and the staff and others are making that look okay. But that number of cost of education, that one slide that you had on there of the free and reduced lunch and that sort of thing, that covers some more challenging educational opportunities that cost more too. You can't do that in 30-person classrooms.
All right, we can move on to item 3, which is, skip, we did item 1 under new business, now we're on item 2 of new business. Discussion of possible approval of establishing the date, time, place of the annual meeting and budget hearing for 2016. Susan?
I move approval of the establishment of the 2016 annual meeting to be held on Wednesday, October 5th, 2016 at 7 p.m. in the district office.
Second.
Any discussion? You just wait it.
Has a committee reported out on that?
Did a committee report out on the annual?
Was that a committee study?
The
I
only-
don't believe so. It's in our policy that we can do it.
I know.
Carrie?
I just had one question about that, which was how the district calendar events are settled for things like conferences and concerts and that kind of business, and, are we ahead of the curve of
Yeah.
knowing all that stuff?
Yeah, none of those are set for next year, so.
Let's
we
beat them to
have-
it.
Yes,
And claim the date.
yep.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Item 3, discussion of possible approval of the resolutions authorizing us to exceed the revenue limits on our non-recurring, the revenue limit for non-recurring basis for our debt service payments. This is to finance the energy efficiency measures and items we've taken over the last couple of years. Refinance, we have to do this annually.
So we have 2. Typically, we've only had 1 resolution. Now we have 2. And like Peter said, that we have to do this annually. However, there were some changes. So this is the last time you'll have to do this, because when you look at the resolution, it has all of our debt service stuff up there. You could do it again to remove the resolution, but that would mean that you would be willing to take that money out of Fund 10. The other change that is impacting this is that the debt service has to be reduced of what we can levy outside of the revenue limits by the actual savings that we received this year in energy savings. And so that savings equaled $96,774. That is computed by McKinstry, because they are our preferred performance contractor. So in order for us to have a resolution and to do we have to have a performance contractor, and they do all the indicators. So you're approving the 2 resolutions, and this will be the only time you have to do that for the life of the bond.
Okay.
What is the motion?
If we have a motion to approve the resolution for revenue limit exemptions for energy efficiencies under Act 32, Phase 3. Got these in backwards order, I think that's what. If we could have did anybody get that? Okay, we need a resolution to approve.
So I have to approve the separate-
I'm sorry, we need a motion to approve the resolution for revenue limit exemptions for energy efficiencies under Act 32, Phase 3, as presented.
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Now I need a motion for approval, we need a motion for approval of a resolution for revenue limit exemptions for energy efficiencies under Act 32, Phase 2, as presented.
I'll move. So moved.
Been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, item 4, discussion and possible approval of 2015-2016 budget. Jared?
Yep, so 2 attachments is our final revenue limit worksheet, just for your fun entertainment to read and look at what we get to go through. No. But then the formal final budget adoption for DPI, and I did list out in administrative contents some of the changes from what I had presented at the budget hearing at the annual meeting to what you're actually approving. You know, realistically, the biggest change is that we were projecting to have a growth of resident students by 79. We only saw 24. It's still a growth, which is positive. But so that ultimately reduced some of those revenues that we had anticipated receiving. So I laid it out that the source 210 taxes are decreasing. We're actually seeing an increase in our open enrollment because as we started seeing that development, we started allowing some additional open enrollment to come in to offset some of that. We were, from our estimates on state aid, just off by $21,000, which was nice to see that we actually got an increase over what we were projecting. And then we did get a small increase in computer aid. So.
Oh, that's what that $3,000
Yeah.
is for.
So, and then on the expenditure side, I had listed out, some of the changes that we had made. Obviously, we saw the decrease of dental insurance come in, which is some savings, a position reorganization of some positions, and then the impact of the energy exemption that we couldn't pass along on our revenue limit. So to give you that calculation so you can see why it balanced out. If we would have had our 79 students that we had projected, we would not have been looking at a fund balance of 851. It would have been smaller than that. But based on our health insurance and all of our new employees that came in the selection, we were able to reduce what we were taking on the fund balance by, I think, $1,000 from what we were projected. So, but we still realized that, and we made sure that came through.
Yep, and better than going the other direction.
Yes.
So the final number on the deficit, essentially, what's coming out of the fund balance is $851,000?
Yes.
Okay. Susan?
What's the director of special projects?
That
Is that the second job you always do that
Yeah.
we don't know about?
that was our.
That was a position that was proposed and was eliminated.
So it was,
There was a resignation, and we did refill that position.
Right. Do I have a motion for approval of the 2015-16 budget as presented?
So moved.
second.
Been moved and seconded. Any further discussion?
No, thank you, Jared, for all this work.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed?